Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at our top stories. Pope Francis has passed away at the age of 88 as confirmed by the Vatican. The Bishop of Rome and head of the Catholic Church, Pope Francis became pontiff in 2013 following the resignation of his predecessor Benedict XVI. Cardinal Farrell announced the sad news in a statement saying, "Dearest brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis." The world, of course, has been mourning as Pope Francis's death was announced at 7:35. That is when the Vatican say that it took place. World leaders have been sending their condolences and also sending their best wishes to everybody who has been celebrating Pope Francis. Well, looking at those tributes that have been coming in, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Friedrich Merz and Javier Milei are among those to share messages and pictures with the late pontiff. Reports suggest US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has shared confidential details of a Yemen strike in a signal chat for a second time. Questions are growing over his use of an unsecured platform for classified information. Both Russia and Ukraine have accused the other nation of breaching a 30-hour Easter truce as Ukraine reports many drone attacks following the end of the ceasefire. Washington says it would welcome an extension amid peace negotiations. Israel's military says that professional failings were found in a review on the killings of Gaza paramedics and rescue workers on March the 23rd. The military said a commanding officer is to be reprimanded as a result. China has warned countries against striking a broader economic deal with the United States at its expense. This rhetoric continues an escalation in tensions over a trade war between the world's two largest economies. A 9-year-old boy has died, becoming the 7th person to drown in Australia over the Easter weekend. Storm swells washed people into the sea from rocks while 2 people remain missing. Well, our top story today, and Pope Francis has passed away at the age of 88. The Vatican has announced that a public prayer for Pope Francis will take place in St. Peter's Square, inviting the faithful to gather and honour his legacy. The Vatican announced that Pope Francis's body may be transferred to St. Peter's Basilica for public homage on the 23rd of April. However, the same has not been confirmed yet. Meanwhile, tributes are pouring in from world leaders. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney paid tribute to Pope Francis, praising his moral clarity, spiritual courage and compassion. While Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva praised Pope Francis for championing climate action, social justice and challenging unjust economic models with courage, empathy and simplicity. Dr. Congo President Felix Tshisekedi honoured Pope Francis, praising his unwavering commitment to peace, justice and human dignity, and describing him as a great servant of God and a vibrant testament of faith and humility. talking about the early life of the Pope. He was born in as Jorge Mario Bergoglio on December the 17th in 1936 in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and grew up in a working class family of Italian descent. He studied chemical engineering before deciding to join the Society of Jesus in 1958. He was ordained a priest in 1969, and his religious life was marked by deep intellectual formation and pastoral work. He became the Archbishop of Buenos Aires in 1998 and was made a cardinal in 2001. On March the 13th, 2013, after the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, Bergoglio was elected as the 266th Pope of the Catholic Church, taking the name Pope Francis. His election was notable for being the first Pope from the Americas and the first Jesuit Pope. Well, joining us to discuss these developments and this breaking news, of course, that we have been rolling all day is Cynthia Matthews, CJ, an advocate and human rights activist joining us from Buxar in India. Cynthia, thank you ever so much for being here with us. A lot of the messages that we've heard from world leaders and seen from supporters of Pope Francis have spoken about his humanitarian work and outreach. What more can you tell us about what Pope Francis did during his time as the Pontiff?
Thank you for this invitation to join you. First of all, I pray that the Lord may grant eternal rest to the soul of our beloved Pope Francis. Yesterday, we have lost an iconic Pope, a revolutionary, compassionate, and peace-loving leader. It's a loss not only for the Catholic Church, but also for the whole world. The Holy Father is an exemplary example for all the leaders in the world. We are saddened by his demise. I am grateful to God for giving us such a great shepherd in the person of Pope Francis. Yes, we all know that Pope Francis is deeply admired for his commitment to humanity, especially for those on the margins of the society. He made the poor the central focus of his papacy, urging the church to become a poor church for the poor. He used to frequently visit slums, prisons, refugee camps, and war zones, bringing global attention to those forgotten by society. If you look at his own personal life, we see how he declined many of the luxurious papal privileges and chose to live in a modest Vatican guest house rather than the apostolic palace. He lived the values of the gospel, not just preaching, but practicing it in his very own life. He was a true follower of Christ, I would say, Christ who was poor, humble, and merciful. And we know his environmental leadership is really commendable. He authored Laudato Si, an encyclical on the environmental and climate change. He called for urgent action against global warming, stressing that care for the planet is a moral, spiritual responsibility. He played a major role in shaping faith-based engagement with the Paris Climate Agreement. He was a person for all and for all seasons. He once said, "To change the world, we must be good to those who cannot repay us." That spirit really shaped everything he did.
Yes, Cynthia, of course, Pope Francis's outreach was felt worldwide, given the fact that he spoke out for Catholics and non-Catholics. What legacy does he leave behind in that front?
So Pope Francis will be remembered not just for what he taught, but how he lived and who he reached. He leaves behind a legacy of mercy, humility, and inclusion. As we know, he was a pope for the margins. His consistent outreach to the poor, refugees, prisoners, people with disabilities, and victims of injustice showed a church that walks with the suffering, not above them. Pope Francis insisted that the church must go to the existential peripheries, places of poverty, war, and exclusion. and not just remain in safe centers of power. And we know he has visited slums in Kenya, Brazil, refugee camps in Greece and Bangladesh, war zones in the Central African Republic and Ukraine. So he lived what he preached. This is what he said, I quote, "You pray for the hungry, then you feed them." That's how prayer works. So he leaves behind a legacy of strong global peace builder. He reached out to atheists, Jews, Buddhists, and people of all faiths with the message that our shared humanity comes first. He frequently condemned religious fundamentalism and promoted dialogue, listening, and peace building. Pope Francis became a global moral voice, reaching far beyond the borders of the Catholic Church. So with his groundbreaking encyclical Laudato Si, as I mentioned earlier, Pope Francis became a global leader on climate and environmental justice. He called the planet our common home, linking ecological destruction with the social inequality. He inspired movements among young people, faith communities, and even policy leaders to treat climate change as a moral emergency. The co-facilitator of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, when they were negotiating for the SDG goals, they had acknowledged Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si as a significant moral and ethical contribution to global development discussions. Pope Francis' concept of integral ecology introduced in this encyclical underscores the interconnectedness of social, economic, and environmental issues. This holistic approach aligns with the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, emphasis on addressing multiple dimensions of development simultaneously. The encyclical's influence was evident during the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, where its moral imperative contributed to the ease of consensus among United Nations member states.
Yes.
In his address to
Cynthia, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We are unfortunately out of time, but thank you very much for providing your insights. As the world mourns the death of Pope Francis, they also celebrate his life and work as the pontiff. We move on now to North America, and the United States Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is facing serious questions. A report by the New York Times says that before US strikes on Yemen in March, Hegseth shared details of the mission in a private Signal chat. That chat reportedly included his wife, his brother, his lawyer and others without security clearance. According to the Times, the group also included two of Hegseth's senior advisors, Dan Caldwell and Darren Selnick, who were fired last week for allegedly leaking unauthorized information. Details shared in the chat allegedly included flight schedules for US fighter jets. The Pentagon has denied the claims, calling them false and politically motivated. A spokesman called the New York Times, and I quote, Trump-hating media outlets. But pressure is growing. Lawmakers and former officials are calling for Hegseth's removal, saying his actions risked national security. Well, this comes after The Atlantic also revealed a previous group chat on Signal where sensitive information was shared. Despite the backlash, the White House and President Trump continue to support Hegseth. Here is what Hegseth said when asked about the Signal chat leak.
You know, what a big surprise that a few leakers get fired and suddenly a bunch of hit pieces come out from the same media that peddled the Russia hoax. Won't give back their Pulitzers. They got Pulitzers for a bunch of lies. Pulitzers for a bunch of lies. And on hoaxes, time and time and time again. And as they peddle those lies, no one ever calls them on it. See, this is what the media does. They take anonymous sources from disgruntled former employees, and then they try to slash and burn people.
Well, joining us to discuss this latest development surrounding Pete Hegseth and a potential second signal chat is Ross Feingold, a political risk analyst joining us from Taipei. Ross, we are here again. We've spoken on this programme about the previous leak, and I remember you saying that this will blow over and it will stop being talked about. Well, we are here again talking about a potential second chat. Do you think that Pete Hegseth can recover and survive this second leak?
The likelihood that he could recover and survive is probably high. President Trump is extremely reluctant to change his leadership team or his cabinet secretaries so soon after starting his presidency. And frankly, Republicans in the House and Senate are going to be very supportive of the Trump administration and the Trump administration's personnel. So the Republicans in the House and Senate, they're not looking to make trouble for the Pentagon or for the Secretary of Defense or for President Trump. So I would also think that there's a higher likelihood that this will blow over than Trump relieving Hegseth of his duties.
Yes, Ross. If it does blow over, what does that say about national security? If this alleged second chat is true, and if the evidence is there, then how can Pete Hegseth stay in position when, given the fact that we know this is classified information, Signal isn't a government chat, it is a separate outsourced chat site which is used. So if this is proven to be true, how can the American people and how will Democrats in opposition to the Trump administration react if it's just everything as usual?
Well, of course, the Democrats are going to make an issue of this, and they're going to try and raise it in congressional hearings. They're going to talk about it on television talk shows. And as far as the American people go, I don't think this is a major issue for the American people. I don't think we're going to see rallies in the streets calling for Hegseth's firings. And ultimately, he's the president's guy. The president wants him in the job. And we have to keep in mind that if this was any other civilian or uniformed employee of the Department of Defense, they would be in serious trouble. They might be prosecuted for criminal charges and they would lose their job. But this is the president's guy, and I think he gets a lot of deference from Republicans in Congress, and it's higher likelihood that he'll survive this than he will be removed from his job.
Ross, what does that say about President Donald Trump? You said there that if this wasn't somebody in Trump's top team, they might be facing criminal charges. What does it say about Donald Trump's leadership if this is brushed under the carpet?
The interesting thing there is, based on the experience of his first term, when a number of cabinet secretaries turned over, he chose some people from what we often call the establishment, and then he didn't get along with them. President Trump wants the team that he selected during the transition process after the election and the people he nominated in December and January. We saw the Senate give enormous deference to the president's choices, notwithstanding some legitimate questions about their qualifications for the job. So President Trump really wants the team to stay in place for an extended period of time. He's definitely not eager to change the team only 3 months into the term. So again, I think that's why President Trump will be more comfortable keeping Hegseth than firing him.
Ross, to bring an end to this discussion, I want to talk about some of the people who were in this alleged chat, this alleged signal chat, where discussions were made about these Yemen strikes. Hegseth's wife, Jennifer, a former Fox News producer, his brother, a personal lawyer. We also have Tim Parlatore, who has held positions in the Department of Defense, but it's not clear if these three people would have had the security clearance required to know this information. Also, 2 people have been fired for leaking information. What message does this send?
It's a very good question. The message seems to be that there's different rules for different people. But the Secretary of Defense is going to probably say the same things he said during or after the first incident, which is that technically none of this information was classified. It really shouldn't be public information. It might be confidential information, but it wasn't information that would actually have the classified imprimatur on it. So, they'll just use the same talking points that they used before. It worked for them. They survived the first incident. They're going to try and survive the second incident as well.
Ross Feingold, thank you ever so much, as always, for joining us. As the Pentagon dismisses this second alleged leak, we know that the fallout will continue from Democrats and opposition to Donald Trump's administration. Make sure you're here on NewsX World for all of those developments. We now move over to Europe, and in the latest update, Russian President Vladimir Putin has responded to Ukraine's proposal to pause airstrikes on civilian infrastructure for 30 days. Putin says that Moscow would analyse the proposal before making any decisions. Ukraine's military confirmed that Russian drones attacked several regions overnight, including Dnipropetrovsk, Cherkassk and Mykolaiv. Meanwhile, Russia reported that Ukraine launched over 3,300 drone strikes and carried out 1,404 artillery shellings, targeting Russian military positions and key infrastructure. In another development, Russian President Vladimir Putin has officially signed a law ratifying a 20-year strategic partnership treaty with Iran. The deal, signed earlier this year with Iranian counterpart Masoud Pezeshkian, marks a significant step in the two nations' relationship. Earlier this year, US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth remarked that NATO membership for Ukraine seemed unrealistic. He suggested Kyiv should abandon the goal of reclaiming all of its territory and instead focus on a peace settlement, potentially supported by international troops. In response to US discussions, the Kremlin expressed satisfaction over the Trump administration's stance on excluding Ukraine from NATO membership. Dmitry Peskov commented that Russia's position aligns with this development, expressing a sense of relief that Washington has reiterated its opposition to Ukraine's NATO membership. Meanwhile, China has welcomed all efforts towards achieving a ceasefire in Ukraine. Let's hear what Foreign Ministry spokesman has had to say.
注意到有关报道，中方乐见一切通往停火的努力，这是实现和平的必要一步。希望有关各方继续通过对话谈判解决危机。
Well, joining us to discuss these latest developments from the Russia-Ukraine conflict is John Rossimondo, President of the Viking Research Associates and a geopolitical analyst who's joining us from Washington, D.C. John, thank you very much, as always, for joining us today. I want to bring it back firstly to this 30-hour Easter ceasefire that we had, and strikes have resumed afterwards, but both sides have blamed the other of breaching this ceasefire, with talks continuing to take place around a potential 30-day ceasefire following this partial and 30-hour truce. How realistic would that be if both sides are blaming each other of breaking it when it's only such a short period?
Well, let's put it this way. The Russians never had any intention of honoring. It's just a lot of rhetoric, and the Kiev Post is saying this morning that it was never any sincerity in Putin's so-called Easter truce. So I think that the chances, based on what's going on, for getting a 30-day ceasefire are almost nil.
Yes, John, and I want to look now at some of the comments that we've had in. The Kremlin saying they will analyse this proposal from Ukraine. Is that potentially a positive move, or do you think there might be something else at play with Russia's response?
It's just all rhetoric. The only thing that we get out of the Russians or the Ukrainians is rhetoric. So far, we've seen no real interest in bringing this conflict to a close, to the point that of Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying the United States is thinking of getting out of the talks. So that's the stark reality here. No one is interested in peace.
John, somebody who is still optimistic is President Donald Trump and his administration. They said that they would support an extension to that 30-hour Easter ceasefire, and they still, of course, remain hopeful. But we've heard in recent days that the US may walk away. Is this more posturing, or do you think there is a risk that these ceasefire negotiations could fall?
Well, I think it's a little of both. I mean, first, they're sending a shot across the bow of both the Russians and the Ukrainians that the United States is interested in leaving as a peace broker. Then, you also have the Trump administration saying it would recognize the capture of the territories in Ukraine by Russia. But I just don't see that reality is that the Russians are really interested in any kind of deal. They want to make the deal on the battlefield.
Yes, John, and looking at those military actions, we have seen reports and heard reports that, of course, Russian drones have attacked Ukraine in the early hours following that ceasefire. Air raid sirens being heard reportedly across as much as half of Ukraine. Russia also reporting thousands of strikes from Ukraine. Are we really as far away from peace as we were at the start of this point, where the US got seriously involved in negotiations?
Well, I think that the negotiations were naive from the get-go, because Putin has no intention of allowing Ukraine to be in the Western sphere of influence. It views Ukraine as an integral part of Russia, Russian identity, and it's not going to go anywhere.
Yes, John, and to bring an end to this discussion, optimism is waning, but what is needed, not just from the US, what is potentially needed from other key players in this? China speaking about their willingness to work towards peace. Europe, of course, continuously holding meetings. Is it required from all parties across the globe to really get this over the line, or does it lie in the hands of Russia and Ukraine solely?
It lies in the hands of one person, Vladimir Putin. And if Putin were to decide that he wanted a ceasefire tomorrow, the guns would be silent. But Putin has no interest in anything more than continuing his war of conquest. And the Ukrainians have no interest in putting their arms down, because they don't trust the Russians, and rightfully so.
John Rossimondo, thank you ever so much for joining us and providing us with your insights as the fighting continues between Russia and Ukraine and the diplomacy rolls on. We will be here to bring you all of those updates. But that is all that we have time for. We'll continue to bring you more of the latest breaking news from across the world.